What's the most messed up thing you've seen at work? One of my friends used to work as a corrections officer in both the general population and the mental health unit, and he has some pretty wild stories. One inmate would ask for the time, then start doing push-ups and ask him to let him know when a certain amount of time had passed. My friend would come back an hour later and it seemed like the inmate never stopped. He ended up in medical school a few times for a condition called rhabdomyolysis from overdoing it. Another time an inmate tried to hurt him, so he managed to contest back the inmate down the stairs without him stepping a single step. There was also an inmate who had injured himself badly and was playing with his organ. In another case, an inmate inserted stuff too far and got it stuck. They had to take him to the hospital where a doctor put on a long glove and managed to remove the item inside. The rest were more about typical bodily fluids, excrement, and cell fights. Yikes! Sounds like his guy's friend's job was a never-ending circus of chaos. Definitely not a career for the faint of heart. Story 2. I used to work as a veterinary technician at a clinic in a less privileged area. This often meant that the animals we saw had not received proper care, whether by accident or neglect. One case in particular stood out. A young dog, no older than 2 years, looked as though she were older due to serious lack of care. Her paws had been declawed, causing them considerable discomfort and messy state, and she limped badly. She was also missing an eye, with the owner claiming it was due to a stick injury, which seemed unlikely to me. Her neck had marks. However, these issues were not the worst part. The owner, a middle-aged man, appeared indifferent to his dog's condition. He mentioned that the dog barked excessively and smelled terrible, which is why his wife had insisted he bring her in. When we examined the dog, the smell was indeed unbearable. We discovered an infected spot on her shoulder and decided to trim her fur. To our dismay, her entire side was covered in red, infected skin. We found out that she had been struck by buckshot, which had become infected and then spread throughout her skin. The pain she must have endured was unimaginable, and it was clear that she was beyond help. The owner refused to pay for any treatment and said he would take care of it at home. Later, I overheard him on the phone saying he planned to use the dog for hunting practice, which was deeply upsetting. I informed my veterinarian, who was horrified and wanted to contact animal control. Instead, we decided to tell the owner that the dog had passed away. We made her as comfortable as possible with food and pain medication and gently put her to sleep. Rest easy, little one. Story 3. A patient came into the urgent care unit and we started a thorough investigation for sepsis. His test results were quite concerning. His chemical levels were all abnormal. His WBC count was so high that we had to count them manually because the analyzer couldn't handle the number, and his whiz was filled with white cells and bacteria. It looked like a classic case of a UTI that had become severe, especially for an older person. We expected he would be hospitalized for treatment. However, he was sent home instead. This wasn't a case of the patient leaving against healthcare guidance. The doctor simply said, "Seems like you have a UTI. Go home and drink some cranberry juice." 2 days later, the same patient returned with the same symptoms. We repeated the tests, and while I was manually counting the WBC again, the phone rang. It was the reference lab calling to inform us that the cultures from the patient's previous visit had come back positive. I took the call and informed the ER. We thought for sure he would stay this time. However, he was sent home again with the same advice: go home and drink some cranberry juice. It sounds like that doctor thought cranberry juice was the ultimate cure-all for his condition. And at that point, the patient should be sponsored by Ocean Spray, for all the juice he'd been drinking. Story 4. This incident didn't occur at work, thankfully, but it involved someone I worked with, and what he did was truly shocking. I was about 22 years old at the time and working at a large travel firm in the UK. I was in my second job at their head office. There was a man named Jonathan, who was the global head of social media and marketing, a position appointed by the CEO. He seemed like a nice enough guy. He was American with a cheerful personality, loved Coca-Cola, and was quite outgoing. He was always friendly towards me. At one point, I asked Jonathan if we could connect on LinkedIn. He told me he didn't use social media because he got too many sales pitches. At the time, this seemed a bit unusual for someone in social media marketing, but I accepted his explanation. Jonathan organized a training week for all our European colleagues to come to the UK, and since I was living in London, I didn't need a hotel. After one of the training days, Jonathan took everyone out for dinner and drinks. We all had a few drinks, and at the end of the night, he offered me a place to stay in his hotel room so I wouldn't have to travel back and forth to work the next day. I declined the offer and went home, but I didn't think much of it. Jonathan had always been kind to me and had even promised that if I ever left the company, he'd take me out for a meal as a thank you for my work. A few months later, Jonathan hadn't been at work for a while, and I was informed he had a family meeting and had flown back to the States. I was advised not to contact him, so I respected that. Several months passed without any word from him. Before leaving, I sent Jonathan a text wishing him and his family well and letting him know that I was leaving the company. I also mentioned that if he returned to the UK, I'd love to catch up. A few months into my new job, I received a call with some shocking discovery. It turned out that Jonathan wasn't who he appeared to be. He was actually someone named Roger Allen Geese, a fugitive on the FBI's most wanted list. Geese had left the US just before standing trial for claims of misconduct. He had created a new identity and managed to secure a high-profile role at one of the UK's largest travel companies, despite having no real marketing experience. He emptied their bank accounts and used back channels to escape America. He had left his wife in the US without any warning, taking her out to dinner and telling her what he had done, knowing she would refuse to go with him. By that time, he had already prepared to flee. Looking back, I realized that while I was probably too old for him, I might have avoided a bad situation by not accepting his offer to stay at his hotel room. It turns out he avoided social media to keep his new life in the UK hidden from the authorities. Story 5. Not someone I was particularly close with, but I remember an associate from my investment banking days collapsing at an airport due to severe dehydration and exhaustion. He was working over 100 hours a week, juggling 3 live transactions because there had been a record number of associates leaving the firm. He was promised a promotion and a significant bonus if he could pull it all off. That was the day I realized I needed to leave the industry. For context, I also had a similar experience. During my first year as an analyst, I worked 80 to 90 hours a week for about 2 weeks straight to close a live transaction. After the deal was finalized, we went out for drinks on a Friday. Due to a mix of exhaustion and lack of food, I ended up getting extremely hammered. My mom called me while I was in an Uber home, and I broke down crying uncontrollably. Living far from home with no close friends or support system, I was overwhelmed and exhausted. For those unfamiliar, investment bankers in mergers and acquisitions, M&A, are like real estate brokers, but for selling businesses or parts of them. This job involves creating detailed financial models to show potential buyers or investors the future value of the company. Analysts and associates also handle most of the marketing materials, often referred to as CIMs, confidential information memorandums, which can be over 100 pages long. While the work itself isn't particularly complex, as a junior employee, you have little control over your workload. If a director or VP calls you at 2 a.m. for a last-minute update needed by 9 a.m., you must drop everything to get it done. Story 6. While not as extreme as some stories, I had an experience working at a very large bank that was quite eye-opening. We had an elderly lady, whom I'll call Grace, who had been recently in the hospital after sustaining a hip injury and dealing with an infection. During her hospital stay, her bills, which were set to autopay, overdrew her account several times. This led to multiple overdraft fees stacking up. Each $35 fee resulted in extra charges, and before long, Grace had accumulated over $635 in fees on top of a negative account balance. Grace was a retired teacher who had been a loyal customer of the bank for over 50 years. Her total savings were just over $100,000, and she had a modest monthly pension from her late husband. When she called to ask for help, she was pleading with us to waive the overdraft fees, promising to cover the negative balance. I was committed to helping her, and although I succeeded in reimbursing about $200 of the fees myself, I needed to get approval from my manager to do more. When I approached my manager with Grace's story, his first question was, "How much money does she have with us?" He seemed to believe that customers with more money deserved more consideration. I told him Grace had just over $100,000 in her account. After reviewing her account, he said he didn't think we could waive any more fees. I was disappointed and escalated the request to our unit manager, who also declined the request, citing that the, quote, household balance does not support a fee reimbursing. Feeling frustrated, I told Grace that if she covered the entire negative balance to avoid further fees, I would continue to work on getting her fees reimbursed. My colleague and I used our monthly fee reimbursing quotas to return more of the fees to Grace until we managed to pay all of them. Grace was incredibly grateful and thanked me for helping her through this tough time. However, a few weeks later, my coworker and I were called into a meeting room by security and were terminated for attendance violations, specifically being a few minutes late from breaks. I firmly believe that these violations were manipulated by my manager as they started occurring shortly after we helped Grace. Despite my punctuality and the lack of evidence to support these claims, there were no means of resolution. The positive outcome was that I later found a job at another financial institution that valued customer service and appreciated my dedication to helping Grace. Story 7. I was a CNA working at a large healthcare aid home, but for a few days I was covering a shift on a floor I wasn't familiar with. The patients on this floor were unable to talk or move on their own, which is why they needed extra care. During my routine tasks, I cleaned up an elderly woman and noticed something unusual. She was missing a bush in a place where I would normally expect to see it, and her area appeared red and irritated. I thought this might be due to some sort of issue she had, and it seemed odd but not immediately alarming. About an hour later, the head healthcare provider called me and two other aides into an office. She asked if we had noticed anything unusual about any of the residents. One of the other CNAs mentioned seeing reddened areas on two different women. At that point, I realized the patient I had seen with similar symptoms was also affected. It turned out that a male CNA working on that floor was involved in inappropriate behavior with the patients. The authorities were notified and the staff member was dismissed from their position. I didn't learn much more about the case since I soon moved to a facility closer to home. While I've encountered difficult situations in my career, this one was particularly troubling. Story 8. When I was a teenager, I worked the overnight shift at a Jack in the Box on 16th Street and Van Buren in Phoenix, Arizona back in the late 80s. Now, if you're familiar with the area, you know it could be pretty tough. One night around late, two men in a car were waiting in the drive-thru. They weren't complaining about the wait, but the driver behind them, a man of Hispanic descent, was extremely impatient and kept honking his horn, possibly because he was intoxicated. Eventually, this man's car rolled forward and lightly tapped the vehicle in front of him. The two men in the front car got out, approached the Hispanic man, and began to harm him. The scene was quite intense. After the altercation, the two men returned to the drive-thru window, collected their food, and left without saying anything. The man who had been harmed was clearly distressed and had noticeable hematoma starting to appear and drove up to the window. At this point, a young employee who wasn't on the schedule that night but was just hanging out approached him and demanded $20. Surprisingly, the man handed over the money. Then, the shift manager at the Jack in the Box also demanded $20 from the harmed man who complied. The manager then looked at me and asked if I wanted $20 as well. I was taken aback, but wanting to avoid further distressing the man and believing the police might come soon, which they didn't, I declined the offer. The manager then threw some frozen tacos into a bag without cooking them and told the man to leave, adding a harsh tone. The man, who had a handicap license plate, drove off, and the whole situation left me feeling unsettled. Story 9. I used to work as a customer service agent for a clothing company that catered to stylish European millennials. My main tasks involved handling questions about returns, lack of items, and shipping delays. We also had a phone line for customers who preferred to speak with us directly. So one day, I logged into the system and saw an urgent request from a customer who had reached out multiple times before. They had sent several pictures and spoken with different agents previously, but I hadn't checked the details yet. To understand the urgency, I decided to load the pictures, which were initially displayed as blurry rectangles. To my surprise, the images were quite inappropriate, including some very unusual photos. This customer seemed to be a known troublemaker who had been sending such kinds of material to the chat for a while. It was my first month on the job, and I was taken aback, but my colleagues seemed unaffected. I quickly learned later that in customer service, you need to become resilient. Another strange incident involved a customer who received the wrong item after placing an order online. She had ordered a summer dress on sale but received a box containing whiz samples instead. I was at a loss for how to handle the situation and could only suggest that she dispose of the items immediately. It was a strange error, and I joked to my coworkers that maybe someone in the warehouse had a breakdown, though I didn't share that with the customer. The most surprising part, though, was that the customer asked if she could exchange the whiz samples for the dress at a physical store. Story 10. One evening, while working late, I walked away from my desk to talk to a colleague at their desk across the office. My girlfriend at the time had baked some cookies for me, and I had left them on my desk. When I returned, I noticed that the janitor, who was the only other person in the office, had started eating my cookies. I was quite surprised and taken aback by this. On another late night at the same office, I heard a clicking sound coming from the break room. I looked over and saw the same janitor collecting free soft drinks from the vending machine and placing them into his janitor cart. The vending machine didn't require any money, so the drinks were essentially free for anyone to take, but it seemed odd that he was gathering so many. To address this, we set up a video camera to record the break room. The next night, the janitor appeared, repeating the same behavior. We presented the footage to HR, and as a result, he was replaced by a different janitor. A while later, I changed jobs and started working at a new office a few blocks away. To my surprise, one evening I was working late again, and who should show up but the same janitor from my previous office. It was quite the coincidence and made me chuckle. Story 11. I worked in hospital security and had a challenging experience involving a young patient. He had been brought in by his mother for a mental health hold. This patient had severe autism and other disabilities that require a feeding tube directly attached to his organ. He had difficulty eating normally and would only consume his own instead of regular food. His mother lied to secure his admission to a facility that promised to offer one-on-one care, but it turned out the facility was actually providing 3-to-1 care. This led to him being transferred to our hospital. The patient had to wear diapers and could only move by scooting on his bottom. He couldn't stand the physical contact and often exhibited behaviors that were challenging for staff. Most of the time, he would harm or scratch staff members. My role was to monitor him closely and ensure he didn't leave the room, which meant observing his body language and behavior carefully. Now, during my shifts, I expressed my frustration in the security office about the RN who questioned how a mother could leave her child. I wondered aloud if after raising such a child for many years, anyone would want anything other than relief from the situation. After a few days, the patient became extremely unsettled. I reviewed the security logs to see if there was any change in his behavior or any factors that might have affected him. According to the records, there were no notes about his food or water intake, and there were barely any records of medical staff visiting him. I informed the charged RN about this, and she checked her records. It turned out the patient had not been fed or given water since his arrival, which had been several days. It was discovered that he had a feeding tube meant for a child, but our hospital didn't have the correct size for an adult. An RN had to drive to a children's hospital to obtain the proper feeding tube. A few hours later, the ER doctor performed a hands-on exam. The patient, already very sensitive to touch, was restrained during the exam and cried out after the doctor left. I opened the door slightly to try to offer some comfort. I held his hand while wearing gloves and scratch sleeves, and for a minute he signaled me to pet his head like a dog. Doing this seemed to calm him, but it also deeply troubled me. Seeing the little comfort he could find in such a difficult situation, combined with his suffering and the lack of proper care, it was all heartbreaking. I decided to leave the job about a week later as the experience had taken a significant emotional toll on me. Story 12. I worked at a small store in the Northeast U.S. that sold beer and snacks. It was a rural area but close to a big university. Donald was a popular figure there, and I'm black. One afternoon around 4 p.m., after finishing the more demanding tasks, I was listening to music and doodling. A younger-looking guy came in, and I greeted him with, "What's going on, bud?" to make him feel welcome. He glanced at me but didn't respond, then left the store. I chuckled at the whole thing and went outside for a cig, wondering if I was about to be robbed. As the day went on, I felt uneasy, sensing that something strange might be happening. Later, the same guy returned while I was restocking. This time, he had changed his clothes and demeanor. He greeted me with a friendly, "Sup, bud?" before I could even react. He approached the counter, grinning widely with an All Lives Matter shirt on and his ID ready. I was stunned. It seemed so deliberately provocative and out of place that it was almost comical. I didn't know what to make of it, as it felt both offensive and absurd. It was such an over-the-top move that it became hard to take seriously even. I just stared at him, bewildered, and tried to process what was happening. It was bizarre and unsettling, almost like a psychological tactic. It's not the worst thing I've seen at work, but it left a lasting impression. Every time I see him, he's always smiling, and the phrase, "stay safe," feels more like a veiled risk. Story 13. While working at a marina during college, I witnessed some intense incidents. One day, a boat from the boat club sped into the fuel dock with people shouting frantically. As it docked, I saw several people pressing towels on a man in the front of the boat, and the deck was covered in red fluid. This caused severe injuries. When the ambulance arrived and moved him onto a gurney, he was badly injured. I later heard that he survived, but it was a very tough recovery for him and he was never quite the same. Another memorable event involved an old cabin cruiser that exploded after being refueled. The blast hurt people, including some children. One of the engines had stalled, and when the captain tried to restart it, the gas fumes ignited. This was a stark reminder of the importance of always running the blower to clear out any fumes. Alright, if you're enjoying the video so far, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. On to the next story. Story 14. A woman came into the ER who was struggling with severe bad habits. Her arms were in terrible condition, she had large abscesses, each about the size of a baseball, and her arms were badly injured and swollen. They looked discolored, much like what you might see in someone who has passed away and whose red fluid flow has ceased. Despite this, her arms still had pulses, so there was some circulation. However, her arms were extremely swollen. She was experiencing significant discomfort, but because of her high tolerance for medicines, we struggled to manage her discomfort effectively. She was constantly crying and screaming, shaking, and then passing out, only to wake up and repeating the cycle all over again. Eventually, the decision was made to take her to surgery. The medical team wanted to either amputate one or both arms, but she refused to consent to that. Even so, they proceeded with surgery to drain, clean, and remove the necrotic tissue from her abscesses as much as possible. I thought that would be the end of the story, since I only see patients in the ER and don't follow their outcomes. However, she returned about a week and a half later with similar issues. The plan had been to keep her in the hospital for IV and antibiotics to help with the infection, but she had managed to sneak out of the hospital while still connected to her IV line, which was placed in a special line in her chest called a central line. The IV was supposed to help for a while, but when it became blocked and stopped working, she just left it partially removed and taped with Scotch tape covered in dirt. While she was away from the hospital, she neglected her wounds, which required dressing changes 4 times a day. Instead of caring for them, she started using her arms again, leading to new abscesses forming. When she returned, her arms were in even worse condition, with fluids on her shoulders and onto the bed. Each time I walked in, she was a tangled mess of hospital linens with her arms sticking out. It was one of the most heartbreaking and alarming experiences I've ever had. I did my best to help her, but I'll always remember the sound she made and the irreversible damage she inflicted on herself in her own struggle. Story 15. An elderly man with serious mental health issues and significant physical health problems from years of substance misuse and was staying in our psychiatric unit. He had a catheter in place and the collection bag was attached to his walker. Now, this detail is important for what happened next. This man had endured a very tough life, including neglect by the American healthcare system and society, especially since his time in Vietnam. One day, someone brought him a 20-ounce Diet Pepsi and he decided to enjoy it in the common area of the unit. As soon as he sat down, a healthcare worker aide told him, "John Doe, you can drink out here, but watch your language." For anyone familiar with high-stress environments where managing and diffusing tension is very important, it's clear that this comment was likely to escalate the situation. The man was an adult who didn't tolerate disrespect, and this felt like an unfair provocation to him. Naturally, he responded by using some strong, colorful language, which made the situation worse. A healthcare provider then came over to see what was happening. Instead of trying to understand the situation, she took a confrontational stance with her hands on her hips and assumed the man was at fault. She ordered him back to his room, which was unreasonable given his health condition and would have caused him considerable discomfort. The man refused to comply and hurled the bottle cap from his soda at her. This action led to her trying to restrain him. At this point, the healthcare aide and another staff member joined in. They restrained the 74-year-old man and began dragging him back to his room. In the process, they didn't think to take his walker, which was attached to his catheter. This all happened in just about a minute. Seeing what was happening, I intervened immediately, shouting at them to stop and quickly grabbing his walker to prevent further injury. They stopped and I helped him walk to his room as gently as possible. I was so bothered by the incident that I reported it to HR. Coincidentally, our hospital was in the process of recertifying its accreditation at the time. My report was escalated to the head of the healthcare provider, but despite the seriousness of the situation, no real action was taken. The staff who were involved all sided with each other and blamed the elderly man instead of acknowledging their mistakes. I was excluded by the group and eventually left the job about 6 months later. Unfortunately, situations like this were not uncommon. The state of mental health care in this country is deeply troubling. Story 16. I used to work at an art studio that created illustrations for clinical litigation, which meant I was shown some very intense and alarming images. Our job was to receive and work with all kinds of evidence for legal cases. This could include photographs, security footage, and more. We saw a lot of graphic content. One particularly striking case involved a car accident where a driver was going too fast at night and didn't see a semi-trailer in his path. The impact caused the roof of his car to crumple in a way that resembled opening a can of food. But the most unsettling case I ever encountered was about a child involved in a car accident. The child was in a car on the highway but wasn't wearing a seatbelt. When the car had bumped into one of those median cut-throughs, it went from 70 miles per hour to a complete stop almost instantly. Story 17. Here's a story that really stuck with me from my job in a vacation town. One evening, a couple in their late 30s came in with their two sons. It was around 11 p.m., and the parents were noticeably intoxicated. They began to argue, though I didn't catch what started it. The argument ended with the husband saying, "If we're done, then tell the kids." The wife then knelt down in front of the younger son, looked him in the eyes, and said, "Mommy and Daddy are getting a divorce." She then stormed off while the older son ran after her. The younger child stayed behind with the father, crying. What was even more unsettling was when I remarked to a lady about how challenging kids can be, and she responded, "You can give birth to them, but you don't have to love them." Story 18. Here's a story from my time as a drone operator inspecting sewer lines that truly illustrates how hazardous things can get in our line of work. One day, my coworker and I arrived at a manhole in an ordinary city in Florida. We set up our equipment, which included an 80-pound drone and its cables, and opened the manhole for inspection. At first glance, the sewer line looked a bit dirty, but nothing unusual. The sediment at the bottom was mostly sand and debris, which is typical for Florida sewers. Messes and biological matter generally don't stick around in the sewer for long, so seeing sand wasn't out of the ordinary. However, sediment in the sewer can be problematic for a drone. The wheels on the drone are made of metal and are extremely rough, designed to grip the surface for better movement. They're like metal shards mixed up in a sink disposal, very specialized and very expensive. The entire setup costs around $70,000. To inspect the sewer lines, we need to push the drone as far as possible down the line. Every foot it moves means dragging an additional 5 pounds in cable, so our usual limit is about 300 feet before we need to pull it back and reset at another manhole. We spend about an hour pushing the drone as far as it will go, recording video to check for any damage. So on this particular day, after about 30 minutes of moving the drone, we got stuck. We decided to turn on the recording and try to pull it back manually. As we were pulling, the drone moved about 3 feet, and then we saw something that made us panic. The sediment was hiding something that looked like thick, flaky snow, crystals, which pointed to the presence of H2S gas. H2S, or hydrogen sulfide gas, is a hazardous gas that can build up in sewers. It's colorless and odorless in low concentrations, which means you might not know it's there until it's too late. At low levels, it is harmful and can cause lives in seconds. In higher concentrations, it smells like rotten eggs, and at very high levels, it turns into crystals. When we realized what was happening, we immediately abandoned the truck and ran away from the manhole as fast as we could. The situation turned into a major incident. The area was evacuated, and healthcare services, including police, hazmat teams, and federal agents, arrived to handle the situation. We had to communicate with them via walkie-talkie to guide them on how to retrieve our equipment from the sewer, as we weren't allowed near the site. This experience was incredibly terrifying. We narrowly avoided a disaster that could have been catastrophic for the entire city block. The danger of H2S gas, combined with the flammable materials stirred up by the drone, made this the most alarming situation I've ever encountered at work. Story 19. Here's a story about a couple of unsettling experiences I've had at work that really stuck with me. At one of my serving jobs, there was a girl who was struggling with a bad habit. Despite her challenges, she was really nice, but she often showed up late for shifts and sometimes called out unexpectedly. One day, the manager decided to fire her. However, instead of handling it discreetly, the manager called in her friends who also worked there and had them come in on their day off to witness the situation. The manager made a big spectacle out of firing her in front of the restaurant and all the guests. I felt that, while firing her was necessary, making a public display of it was unnecessary and harsh, especially since her problems were clearly linked to her habit. In another job, which was a corporate setting, the way they handled terminations was just as disheartening. They would often send out emails asking employees to meet in the break room where they would be let go in front of a group. There was one instance when a colleague of mine who was on his lunch break received an email about this meeting after he returned. He asked our manager about the email, and the manager, knowing he was about to be fired, told him not to worry about it. So he continued working, unaware of what was about to happen. At the end of the day, he was told he was being let go. Both situations felt deeply unfair and lacked compassion. They illustrate how important it is for employers to handle sensitive matters like terminations with empathy and respect for the individuals involved. Story 20. I used to manage at a local pizza chain in New England, mainly in Rhode Island. One day, I was working at the Warren location with the general manager, a shift leader, and two other employees. It was a calm day, and we were preparing the store for the dinner rush. The GM was breaking down boxes with a new razor blade and wasn't being very careful. While I was cleaning the dining area, I suddenly heard a loud scream. I turned around to see the GM holding his right arm, clearly in pain. Unfortunately, he had accidentally hurt himself, badly. The injury was severe. I quickly took action, holding his arm over a trash bin and wrapping paper towels around it to help control. I had one of the employees call 911 and lock up the store to keep customers away while I focused on the GM. I also used an apron to make a makeshift tourniquet to help further with the hemorrhaging. The paramedics arrived quickly, but it felt like an eternity before they got there. They took over from there, and the GM ended up losing a significant amount of red fluid and got a serious scar from the injury. What really stayed with me from that day was the feeling of dried red fluid on my hands and the difficulty of washing it off, trying to go back to work as if it were just another normal day. It was one of the most intense experiences I've had at work. Story 21. There was a woman at work who had been with us for about 4 months. Our office is dog-friendly, so she brought her English bulldog to work with her. One day, while we were heading to the break room, the dog suddenly started squatting as if it was about to relieve itself. I mentioned, "Looks like it's time for a bathroom break for the pup. There's carpet cleaner in the janitor's closet you can use afterward to clean up." Instead of just letting the dog finish its business and then cleaning up as usual, she made a surprising move. She dove towards the dog and actually caught the poop in her hands as if she were catching a small bird falling from a tree. The dog made a mess directly into her hands, so I had to step in and suggest that she should take the mess to the bathroom and flush it rather than just throwing it in the kitchen trash. It was definitely an unusual and unexpected situation. Story 22. I once worked as a newborn photographer for a company that partnered with hospitals. Our service offered free photo sessions for new mothers in the hospital, and we would edit and provide access to the photos the same day. While the photo sessions themselves were free, families had the option to purchase photo packages if they wanted to keep the images. During my training, I learned how to handle and raise newborns, including how to manage situations where the baby might be in the NICU or needed special care. An aspect of the job that wasn't widely discussed was photographing babies who had passed away. These sessions were offered at no charge and were intended as a gift to grieving families if they chose to have them. On my first day working alone, I was assigned a session involving a baby who had passed away. Since I've never had children myself, I can't truly understand what the mother was going through. But as a photographer, witnessing the mother's pain when she first saw her baby and taking photos in such a heartbreaking situation, it was something I'll never forget. It was an incredibly emotional experience, and I rarely talk about it because of how profoundly upsetting it was. The image of that little baby and the mother's sorrow has stayed with me. Story 23. I work in content moderation, which means I handle and review material to make sure it doesn't contain harmful or alarming content. My job helps ensure that people don't come across some of the worst things online. One of the most memorable and alarming experiences I had was dealing with a live video of someone who had confessed to previous offenses and was engaging in inappropriate behavior. Seeing such things and troubling content firsthand is a significant part of the job that just stays with you. In a different role, I had to deal with a particularly difficult situation involving a deceased person. A parent was searching for their child, and we found it in a locked single person bathroom. We had to force open the door to get to the parent and deliver the heartbreaking news. The parent's reaction, a mix of horror and grief, was deeply affecting, especially knowing that the situation was beyond saving by the time we arrived. Story 24. I work at a veterinary clinic, and unfortunately, I often see situations where pets are suffering because their owners delay necessary decisions. One of the hardest parts of the job is dealing with cases where it's clear that humane euthanasia is the kindest choice, but some owners continue to push for more treatments, even when it's evident that their pets are in severe pain. For example, we once had a dog who was unable to stand without having seizures and hadn't eaten for a week. The owners kept taking her to specialists who all confirmed the same thing: she was dying and in significant pain. Despite this, they were reluctant to accept that euthanasia was the compassionate option. Another difficult case involved a dog with cancerous tumors. When we prepared her for cremation, we had to remove the bandages. The dog was confused and looked for her owner throughout the process, and she passed away before her owner arrived. There was also a cat whose owner was convinced that the medication we provided was making her pet worse, despite being informed that the cat was terminally ill. The owner believed that we were harming the cat with the pain medication, even though it was meant to provide comfort in her final days. These kinds of situations are incredibly challenging, and they highlight how important it is to make compassionate decisions for our pets. Delaying necessary actions or refusing to accept a pet's suffering can lead to unnecessary pain for both the animal and the owners. Consider your pet's well-being and consult with your vet to make the best choices for their comfort and quality of life. Story 25. I didn't witness this directly, but I heard about a tragic incident involving one of the top medicine students at Edinburgh University. She was in her final year and just months away from graduating when her bike wheel got caught in a tram line, causing her to fall. I had previously conducted census checks for this student, so the news affected me deeply. Her family had already booked flights from Hong Kong and arranged for her graduation tickets, so it must have been incredibly hard for them to learn that their daughter, who was on the verge of becoming a doctor, had passed away. International students pay significant fees for their education, and they had invested a lot over the years she was studying there. The graduation ceremony was especially heartfelt. The university covered the family's travel and accommodation costs and gave them front row seats. The student was awarded her degree posthumously and also received an academic excellence award. Her brother accepted these honors on her behalf, and the ceremony ended with a 5-minute standing ovation. Many professors, students, and attendees were visibly moved, making it one of the saddest experiences I've ever witnessed. Story 26. My boss at Moe's Southwest Grill was a unique character. He was a retired surfing instructor from Hawaii who had moved to the mountains to be closer to his ex-wife, who was trying to keep their children from him. Despite his unusual background, he was a great boss, but he had his quirks. One afternoon, during a quiet period at the restaurant, a homeless man, clearly unstable, came in and endangered me with a rusty weapon, demanding all the money from the register if I wanted to stay safe. The register was visible through a one-way mirror in my boss's office, and I glanced over just in time to see him running out the back door. While I was trying to empty the register and keep a safe distance from the man, my boss burst in through the side door wielding a baseball bat. He swung it at the man fell but started flailing his weapon around. In response, my boss sprayed him. Next, my boss pulled out a weapon he always carried for self-defense. He wrestled the weapon away from the man and began shouting about using it on him if he didn't surrender, all while trying to restrain him. I called the police, who arrived quickly and managed to subdue the man before my boss could take any further action. After the situation was under control, my boss said to me, "If he had a weapon, I would have done worse. It's our word against his, and you're more important than the money." He then gave me a hug, handed me a drink, and went back to his office to put away his weapons. I was in shock. I had never seen him act like that before, though he was known for being a bit unpredictable. He was fiercely loyal and a good friend, but his readiness to resort to such extreme measures was surprising to me, especially since he had never been in the military. Wow, it sounds like that boss was channeling their inner action hero with a side of spray. Who knew that surfing and crisis management were actually a pretty good combo? Alright, if any of these stories got to you, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're gonna love this. I'll catch you in that video.